Good afternoon and welcome to the June meeting of the Divorce Support Club with me, Claire Macklin, and today I'm joined by Fiona Griffin. We set up the Divorce Support Club a couple of years ago now to provide an extra service to the purely legal to help you to handle the journey through your separation or your divorce with clarity and confidence, to see choices and options, and ultimately to create a new life after your separation or your divorce. And today, we're going to talk about cohabitation and living with somebody again after divorce or separation. Before that, Fiona, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks very much, Claire. I'm Fiona Griffin and I'm the Divorce and Relationships Team Leader at Walker Family Law. I'm a family law solicitor. I've been qualified for 24 years this year, and I do everything to do with separation and divorce, but I'm particularly interested in helping clients reach a resolution in the most amicable and cost-efficient way that they can. And to that end, we also offer our service, which is Resolution Together, which I have done for the last 15 months now. So that's where I act for a couple together to help them to find that resolution rather than as a lawyer for just one of them.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And for me, I'm Claire Macklin. I'm a divorce coach, so I work with clients on the emotional side, supporting clients so that they can make those choices that need to be made through this process, and so that they can make them confidently and communicate really clearly. So on to our topic for today. We're talking about cohabitation, and there are a few themes that we wanted to cover today. We're going to, first of all, look at some of the myths around cohabitation, what the law actually says. And we're going to think then about the kinds of questions that would be really good for you to ask yourself before you go into cohabiting with somebody new post-divorce. How can you protect yourself? How can you protect your property? How can you protect your children, and so on. So first of all, when I was thinking about this particular topic, I was thinking, as human beings, we are wired to want connection and to feel that we belong. And I don't know if any of you listening have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but the lowest sort of it's kind of a triangle, and right at the bottom of that triangle are our sort of basic biological, physiological needs like food, water, shelter, warmth, sleep, those kinds of things. At the next level up, we need to feel safe. So we need to know that we are secure, that we have stability, that we are protected, that we have order. And then the next level up is belonging. So that we have family, we have affection, we have relationships, we have relationships at home and at work, and all of those things that help us to feel fulfilled. Beyond that, we have needs to have achievement, status. These are what he calls the esteem needs. And above that, personal growth, fulfillment. And so I think this partly explains why many of us go from being married or with somebody to separating and divorced. And then within a few years, a large percentage of those people go into new relationships, and we move into living with somebody else, creating a new life with somebody else, because we need it. It's a human need to want to belong, to want to feel loved, to want to feel connected. So we wanted today to look at some of the issues that this brings up commonly for people. So I was going to ask, first of all, Fiona, from a legal perspective, what's the legal status of couples who live together but aren't married?
Thanks, Claire. So I just want to reiterate what you've said, first of all, really, because my experience is that, no matter how difficult and distressing a divorce is, it was really unusual for me to find that clients don't then move on and find a new relationship at some time, for all that they might tell me that they have no intention of doing so. So it really is a need for people to have that sense of belonging, most definitely. So in terms of the legal side, Well, there really isn't a legal status for couples who live together. And this can come as a significant surprise to some people, because there are lots of myths out there. And one of those myths is around what people might know as common law wife or common law husband. And these are terms that have cropped up again and again, but they don't have any legal standing. So no matter how long you were to live with somebody for, that doesn't give you any legal rights as respect of them or their property or their financial resources. So, for example, unlike with a married couple where one party might be able to rely on the other to maintain them and pay them spousal maintenance, there's no such right with coming out of a cohabitation. Likewise, if you move into somebody else's property, no matter how long you live there, the chances are you're not going to have any legal right to that property. And as I say, that can come as a significant shock to some people who think that, well, if I've been there for 5 years or if I've been there for 10 years, I'm going to automatically have some rights granted to me by the law. And the answer is simply that you're not.
So when we're thinking about people who are moving on perhaps from divorce and going into thinking about her cohabitation, it's perhaps really important to understand, isn't it, that that isn't going to give you any rights if you move into your partner's property, for example, and sell yours. You're not going to have any rights over their property. And in your experience, Fiona, how simple is it to sort these things out when a cohabiting couple separate?
When a cohabiting couple separate, it can be really difficult to sort out because um, there can be an expectation by one party that they're going to have gained some rights. And so we have to examine in great detail the evidence to see whether or not there might be some chance of making some sort of property claim. And often just the exercise of having to go through all the history that they might have if they've been cohabiting, for 10 or 20 years, let's say, you've basically got to examine the whole of that time that they've been together looking for the clues as to whether or not they might have gained some financial interest in their partner's property. And quite often you find that actually they haven't, but it's a costly and difficult exercise.
Yeah. Okay. And so later on in the session, we'll talk about some of the things that you can do if you're thinking of moving in with your new partner to protect yourself from some of those risks. So that's kind of the legal backdrop to this. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, it's really important as well to understand kind of the emotional impact sometimes of moving in with a new partner. And I mean, I've done this twice now since my divorce. I've lived with two different people, so quite a lot of experience in what can go wrong and what can go right. So I was thinking about, what are the important things to think about if you are even contemplating moving in with your new partner, quite aside from the legal perspective, from an emotional perspective, really checking in with yourself is going to be really important. Now, have you spent time really getting to know yourself post separation, post divorce? What's really important to you? What do you really value, and what do you want your life to be built around? Um, from my own experience, I didn't spend enough time doing that after my first divorce, I don't think. And so what I did was choose somebody who was just almost the opposite of my ex-husband, which meant that I didn't perhaps really think about who I was. I just went for the opposite of him, and was probably in quite a vulnerable position at that point because I was still really scared of living on my own. I was still feeling quite lonely, so I moved on too quickly. So really spend some time thinking about getting to know yourself. Also have some time, spend some time thinking about the patterns that you might have followed in the past, so mistakes that you might have made in the past, perhaps that you want to do differently. Who do you want to be and who are you going into this new relationship? Um, And also thinking about the other person, is this other person really what I need and want? Or like me the first time round, have you simply gone for the opposite of your ex-partner? And I think when we were talking about this session in preparation, you mentioned people who perhaps have a type, and that you've seen that go wrong sometimes in your experience. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you've seen in that respect, Fiona?
Absolutely. I think often when clients come to me and they tell me about their relationship history, it becomes quite clear that they've gone through this cycle where they have had relationships with people who have similar traits. Um, Particularly that comes up often in children cases, actually, where people might have had children with like their first partner relationship. That's broken down. That partner's been difficult over the arrangements for the children. Now they're in a new situation. And again, they found themselves with somebody who is again being difficult for very similar reasons in relation to the children or maybe financial matters. And so it becomes, startlingly clear when you're sitting with somebody who's telling you their history. It becomes startlingly clear that yes, they do repeat these patterns of behaviour. And I think often, we just go about our lives, don't we? We don't necessarily do what you're saying here, Claire. We don't necessarily spend the time to really reflect on ourselves. We just sort of bumble along and never really sit down and want to do that work, because it can be quite tough work
Yeah,
to
it can.
do.
Yeah, it can be quite tough and it can be quite challenging to do. My experience is that it is massively worth it, because sort of 90+% of all our actions and our behaviors are driven subconsciously. So if we have a certain type that we find attractive, a certain personality that we find attractive, it's really easy to fall into the same pattern, to find somebody else who's very much like that. And if you've grown up, for example, in a family where you had perhaps one very controlling, authoritarian, perhaps parent, I see a lot of clients who then fall into relationships with somebody who's very similar to that. It's familiar, and even though it's probably not very good for us, we fall into it because it's what we're used to. So I would always advise spend some time thinking about who you are, thinking about the patterns that you might have followed in the past, and thinking about how you would like consciously to be different in the future. So if you're some of my clients moving on think about moving in with their new partner before their divorce is finalized from their previous partner. And that got me thinking, is there anything that they need to know legally? Will living with a new partner perhaps affect your divorce settlement, for example? Are there any legal issues that we should be making people aware of there?
Yeah. So often, the financial outcome of a divorce is going to be driven by financial needs. And of course, your financial needs are going to be different if you're living on your own or if you're now living with a new partner. Um, this particularly becomes relevant in the arena of dealing with income for the future. So let's say that you are a person who hasn't worked or has only worked in a limited capacity during your marriage, and coming out of your marriage, you're having some financial support, ongoing financial support in the form of maintenance payments. That's maintenance for a spouse, not maintenance for children. And so you've come out of your marriage, you're having these maintenance payments paid to you. If you then move in with somebody else, or you come together with somebody else and form a new relationship and are cohabiting, then do you actually still need the financial support that you've been having from your former spouse? So your former spouse at that point may have a reasonable case to say, actually, those payments should now stop or be reduced, because you're not just paying your bills on your own anymore. You've got somebody else helping you to pay your bills. So that's something in particular to watch out for. In terms of the capital outcomes of a divorce, cohabitation isn't necessarily going to affect those, although again it could, because you're now looking at maybe getting a new mortgage, a new property with your new partner, and so your needs are going to be different. What
Mm.
some people do worry about is whether their former spouse can make a financial claim against the property or assets of their new partner. And that's one bit of good news. They're never going to be able to make a claim against the property or assets of your new partner, but it might affect what you get if the finances haven't been fully resolved, or if there are ongoing payments to you from coming from your divorce.
Yeah, and I can see that, that would be a problem potentially, if your divorce has gone through on the paperwork has gone through on your divorce, but you haven't settled all the financial division of your assets. I can see that there must be cases where even several years down the line, that could be a real issue.
Absolutely, because not everybody is in a position to or even wants to resolve everything in one go. So,
Mm.
quite often we're seeing clients who have separated actually some years ago, before coming to try and resolve finances. And as we've already said, people's lives will have moved on considerably in that period of separation.
Yeah, it's always worth, I think, adding in here that no two situations are ever the same. So really important to take, legal advice on your particular situation, always. From a sort of an emotional perspective, I think, this is probably where I fell foul after my first divorce, was kind of emotionally relying on the new relationship as a sort of security for your future, and letting that distract you from focusing on the divorce process that you're perhaps going through right now. It's really easy in the first throes of a new romantic relationship to get really carried away and start to dream of, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line with this new person, and lose sight of the here and now and the present. So much like when we were talking about dating, in one of our earlier episodes, it's really important not to um, not to invest too much too soon, in that new relationship. I mean, I think that comes over here. It can be so easy to jump in, can't it, with both feet, and just put to one side all thoughts of protecting yourself, in the divorce process that you're actually in. So I would always say, stop and breathe, really think about what it is you're doing, really think about who you are, who they are, and really take it slowly, one step at a time.
Because it must be really tempting to do
Mm.
that, because divorce is difficult. It can be, a horrible time for people. And so to have relief from that and to just shut the door on it and say, well, no, I'm not even going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on this nicer thing instead. It's so tempting to do, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the new relationship is giving you lots of endorphins and serotonin, and it's all very, very exciting, in the first, few months or so, before you start to notice what that person's faults are, before you perhaps have an argument, before you perhaps see them in a crisis, and don't necessarily like how they behave or whatever it might be. It's so easy to lose sight of protecting yourself for the future. So I'd really caution people, against that. And also, if you've been, like, my first divorce was very sudden and a big shock, if that's happened to you, it really rocks your self-esteem. So it's really tempting to rush headlong into a relationship where somebody makes you feel special again, where you feel really important, and where you can begin perhaps to feel like your self-esteem is being bolstered again. So I would always suggest people to just slow down, really enjoy the new relationship, yes, but don't let it distract you, from tying up all the ends of the previous one. Another discussion, that I think is probably really important, is around where your next, cohabitation takes place. Do you move into their house, or do they move into your house, or do you buy a new house together? And I just wondered, are there any legal, implications of those decisions as well, Fiona?
Yes, very much so. I think this decision is probably one of the most important when you're thinking about cohabiting after a separation, um, because if you are still living in the former family home, let's say, um, there may be what we call a deferred sale arrangement in place. So let's say your divorce has concluded, but because there wasn't quite enough money to sell the house immediately, perhaps you've probably got small children or younger children in this scenario, there may well be what we call a deferred sale arrangement, which says that the property won't be sold until those children are older and in no longer need of a home. But at this point, you really need to check your paperwork, especially if that arrangement has been in place for some time and you may have forgotten the small print, because quite often those sorts of arrangements have other things that will trigger a sale of that property. And one of those things can be cohabitation. So there can be a clause in your financial order that says if you cohabit, and it would usually say for a period in excess of 6 months, then that triggers either a sale of the property or you then have to buy out the other person who's been waiting for the property to be sold. So if your financial arrangement has been put in place several years ago, and it's a long time since you got it out and had a read of it, it's really worth just refreshing your memory as to when that sale is, in what circumstances might trigger a sale.
Mm.
Sorry, Claire, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking. So if so, this is where, if you the property's been transferred, isn't it, into your sole name post divorce? Um, so are there other issues as well if, for example, your cohabitation breaks down, and then you're into another separation effectively, aren't you? So what can you do to protect your property from that risk?
Yeah, so if you have been able to, let's say you've had your former family home transferred into your sole name, as Claire suggested, or even if that home was sold and you're now in a new home that you've just purchased in your own name post divorce, and then your new partner moves in, um, that's fine. We've already said they're not going to have any automatic property rights. But what if, and this happens quite a lot, what if that person and together you maybe fund a new kitchen in your property, or a new bathroom, or a conservatory, or they give up, I know, a couple of months of their lives and remodel the garden or something like that. It needn't be money that they put in, but what if they put in money's worth in terms of their time to improve what is effectively your property? Then that cohabitation breaks down. You are likely to face at least the suggestion of a claim that that person should be reimbursed for their time or money, or worse, that having put their time and money into the property, they now have an interest in it, so that they've got a percentage interest in the overall value, not just to reimburse them for their share of a kitchen. That really is your worst case scenario. And I think the main thing that I would say, the answer to that, is to make sure that you have firm lines of communication with your new partner about what may or may not happen if they input into your property in some way, so that it's very clear from the outset, um, either no matter what they do, they're never going to have a financial interest, or you might decide that you do want to longer term share this property with somebody, and so you might agree for them to gain an interest as time goes on. But whatever you do, whatever you decide, it's really important that those expectations are clear between the two of you. And to make things as clear as they possibly can be, really the belt and braces advice is to have a cohabitation agreement drawn up, so that there is a written evidence of the intention of both people when that cohabitation started. And if it is the fact that your intention is, no matter what this person does in respect of my property, they're never going to have a financial interest in it, then the best way to protect yourself is to have that in black and white. Because, if somebody then does do something to improve your property, they know that's just because they're improving it for both of you while you both share the property. So you have the enjoyment of it, but it's not going to give them anything above that, just the enjoyment. I know it sounds a bit of a passion killer, and I'm probably the world's biggest killjoy. Nobody or very few people want to, come across as looking as if they're selfish in some way, or thinking that the other person is just after them for their money. If you've come out of a difficult divorce and you've got a hard-won property now that is your property, you've really got to take off the rose-tinted glasses and say, no, I've got to do something to protect myself, even if, and hopefully your new partner is the most wonderful person on the earth. It can be a very different picture when a separation does come around.
Well, just to be really clear, a cohabitation agreement could be put in place in terms of your new partner moving into your sole property, and it could also be if you buy a joint property together.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah. If you buy
yeah,
a joint property together, you also have the opportunity on the purchase to define what that legal ownership is going to look like,
yeah.
whether it's going to be just totally joint 50-50, or if one of you has invested into the property in different shares, then you can reflect that in the purchase arrangement. And that is something that you should be discussing with your conveyancer, and your conveyancer should be giving you that advice about how to do things if you have invested unequally into the purchase.
Thank you. So it seems that there are lots of really important conversations to be had when you're contemplating moving in with a new partner. And we've both had a bit of a think about what some of those conversations might be. There are lots of these conversations that it might feel quite scary to bring these things up. It might feel quite challenging, but actually they're all really, really important, so that you can start off feeling really safe and secure and knowing that you're both coming at this from the same angle, because it's so easy, isn't it, to make assumptions. I was thinking about, expectations about how you'll live together. Things like division of chores, who does the cooking, who does the cleaning, all of those kinds of things. It's really easy to make an assumption. You live in separate properties, you see your partner cooking and cleaning for themselves, and you make an assumption that they'll carry on doing that when you're living together. But actually, that might not be the case. So really important to have those those big conversations about those things that can be tricky down the line. Another really important one might be, how does your new partner approach their finances? Are they a spender? Are they a saver? What are you? And are your approaches compatible? And and how do you go about joint spending? How do you plan to go about? Are you going to plan to have one joint account for house stuff like food and bills and that kind of thing? And are you both going to have then separate accounts that you're free to do whatever you want with? And how are you going to work out the parameters? All of that. And I expect you've seen all of those things too, Fiona.
Yeah, and again, a cohabitation agreement can be as much or as little as you need it to be. So the cohabitation agreement can just deal with the property aspects that we've talked about, but it can also deal with, the other practical aspects of life, how you're going to agree to organise the finances. If you did separate, how are jointly purchased things going to be
Mm.
dealt with? So, are you going to incur liabilities together? If you both go along and you're having some fitted wardrobes and you both sign that contract to pay for them and take on that liability, what then? how is that going to be resolved in a separation? So, a cohabitation agreement can deal with the minutiae as well as the bigger items, if you feel that that gives you both some security, because it's not to protect one person at the expense of the other necessarily. It's to give both people clarity for what they can expect from this relationship. And all of these things are things that come out at the other end, because I'm seeing the other end of relationship, when relationships have broken down. And these are the things that break relationships, inequality of or different approach to spending, saving, different expectations about what living together is going to be like. These are things that do cause relationships to break down.
Yes. And in my experience, one of the other things that certainly had an impact on my second marriage was parenting and how you parent your children. We haven't really touched on this yet, but if one or both of you have children, how are you going to integrate the two families together? And we did a few months ago, Lauren and I did a session on blended families and gave some advice around that. Important questions around how you parent your children. How much time have you spent with each other's families? It's very different to go on a week's holiday, than it is to spend every other weekend or 50-50 time or whatever your arrangements might be, with each other's children. So it's really worth asking yourself these questions. Have you seen your partner parenting their children through something tricky, or have you seen things that you really do appreciate about how they parent their children, or are there other things that you really don't like? Because something that can be quite a small irritation to start with, when you're living together, can become something really massive, if you're living with it every day. You know, um, so it's really important to raise those issues early on and have those discussions. And those discussions might be tricky, they might be challenging, but actually they're going to flush things out that if you sweep them under the rug, they're just going to pile up and they will come back later. And they will sort of bite you later on.
Are there places, Claire, that people can go for help and support let's say one person is really keen to have these conversations, but the other person not so? Is there somewhere that people can go for that support?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of sort of parenting kind of coaches out there, people who can help you with that. There's all sorts of information on the internet as well, if you Google. And I mean, I quite often in sessions will talk with my clients about how they can raise difficult subjects, how they can raise things without the other person necessarily becoming defensive. One of the really important things in this is to really focus on listening rather than speaking, so that you're really hearing your partner rather than thinking about what you're going to say next. And after the session, I'll have a think about some particular resources and things, and perhaps we can post them with the with the resources on your website, and for that
Yeah.
sort of some signposts for where people can go. Um, just thinking even further on that, there are issues around, I talked a little bit earlier around patterns in relationships. So not only you thinking about the patterns you followed in previous relationships, but perhaps having conversations with your new partner about how they followed particular patterns in previous relationships. Where did they feel they sacrificed rather than compromised, and how can you make sure that you move forward with really good, clear communication with each other. So these sorts of conversations can be so challenging, but they are really, really important. And actually, they can bring you closer together. I remember being really quite scared of bringing up some of these things with a new partner, because I was worried that we might not agree, or there might be conflict between our approaches. And there's also underneath me there was a fear that if I bring up something that they don't like, or we have conflict over this, that perhaps they'll leave. And that
Yeah.
can be a really big fear for people, especially if you've been left in a previous relationship. My experience now is that when I raise these things with my partner, actually we have a good discussion about it, um, and we learn more about each other. So be really curious in those relationships. So if on those conversations, so if your partner does something that you don't like, be curious about it. I'm really curious to know um, why you do this way. Or, just be really curious, ask lots of questions, and actually those conversations then can lead to you growing closer rather than conflict. The conflict is an opportunity for growth sometimes if you look at it as a way to understand your partner better.
And
Um,
I
go
don't
on.
think it's just new. I don't think it's just new partners that this relates to,
No,
actually, is it? Because
no.
people who are in longer term relationships can also benefit from, if you're already with your new partner, and and maybe have been for some time, these are still useful, really useful conversations to be having. I don't think there's
Mm.
ever a wrong time to have a look at this, is there?
No. One thing that I have done in relationships before as well, which is really helpful and works really well. I learned this from a friend of mine. Is once every so often, maybe once every couple of months, maybe once every 3 months, go out for dinner or go out for a walk together with the intention of talking through anything that might be worrying you, talking through anything that might have happened in the last 3 months that was perhaps irritating or annoying, or was really great and that you really appreciated, and actually have a kind of almost like a review of your relationship. And it's really important to put the parameters around that. So the parameters are, we're having this conversation. These things aren't at their height right now. So I'm not feeling emotion about these things right now. So this is a safe place to talk about it. And you promise both to listen. So you perhaps have, 5 minutes each, you listen, and then you have a couple of minutes to think about it, and then you respond. So that can be a really good way of developing closeness within a relationship as well. And that can work with children, with friends, with romantic partners, all sorts of people. Really helpful. Um, Back to the legal stuff then, Fiona. If you um, decide to sell your property or perhaps rent out your property in order to move in with your new partner, what are your rights then? How is that how is that different, if at all?
Yeah. So on day one, when you move into that property, you have no rights at all. You're just occupying their property by what we call license, which is just effectively an agreement that you're going to live there, a bit like having a lodger. But you don't have any tenancy, so you've got no protection from eviction, and that means that right of you staying there can be removed at any time. And so, if that relationship does break down, in the absence of any other agreement, you can find yourself, without a home in very short order. And of course, if you have sold or rented out your property, then that's a really crisis situation. If you've rented out your property, your tenants actually have more protection than you do, because you can't immediately and automatically evict those tenants, and you might not be able to get your property back very quickly, and certainly not on the same sort of time scale as you might be required to leave the property that you've been sharing. If you've sold your property, you might be even in a worse situation, because where would you go? So thinking about moving into somebody else's property, and giving up your own is something that should be done very cautiously, very carefully, and getting legal advice before you make any sort of decision, I would suggest is really key. A cohabitation agreement can certainly help, um, but understanding the other person's expectations are going to be the main the main thing. If that relationship did break down, how long would that person be prepared for you to stay in your property? In their property, sorry. Would they be happy for you to stay there until you were able to get your own property back, for example? If you've sold your property, would they be prepared to help you to fund, say, a rental while you sort yourself out, help you to pay the deposit? That sort of question does need to be examined. And again, like we've been talking about all the way through, being open and honest about what your expectations are going to be and what the other person's expectations are going to be is very key. The other thing about living in somebody else's property, as we've talked about on the flip side, if you are the person who has, let's say, you've sold your property, so you have some cash, you move into your new partner's property, it's not quite big enough, so you agree to put your cash into improving and extending that property. Have you got any right to get that money back? Again, the starting position is it may be difficult. And by difficult, that always for lawyers means costly and time consuming. So having an agreement in place before you let 1 cent go out of your account towards that improvement or that renovation, again, really vital. You've got to know where you stand before you make any sort of investment. I think this is sometimes, I do find this, I must admit, a bit puzzling. People will spend vast sums of money on properties in which they have no legal interest, and on the basis that they think the other person has the same moral code that they do. And when a separation comes about, they find that that person's moral code is vastly different from what they were expecting. You wouldn't do that with any other sort of investment that you decided to make. You would be reading the small print. Don't do it just because you're in a romantic relationship with somebody.
It's really good advice, isn't it? Not to leap in blindly. And I think, this is another conversation, isn't it, to be had with your new partner or with anybody that you're contemplating moving in with. And so if the other person is unwilling to have those conversations, um, then certainly for me that would raise a question of whether this was really the right person for me. I think, you can tell a lot by people as to whether they are willing to enter into these conversations and whether they are willing to take part in them. And I understand it can be really scary for the other person, but perhaps if go and find some more information about what those conversations will contain and what they could be about. And we've talked a little bit about cohabitation agreements. Are there, oh, and declarations of trust you mentioned, if you're buying property together, are there any other sort of legal protections that you can put in place to make sure that you and your partner are protected?
Yeah, so there's a couple of other things that you're going to want to think about probably. And the first is making sure your will is up to date. Because once you've divorced, it doesn't, if you've got a will on divorce, that will outlives your divorce, but it removes any gift to your former spouse. Um, and that can mean that your will is a bit sort of patchy. And by that I mean there'll be some provisions in it that still are relevant and right, and then there'll be probably a whole host of provisions in it that are no longer relevant to your life or your circumstances. So after divorce, we always recommend that somebody gets a new will done. I've never done any sort of analysis to see how many of them actually follow it through. I think the last thing people want is more involvement with lawyers at that point. So then going into a new relationship, if you haven't already updated your will, it's a really good time to do it. Again, if somebody's moving into your property, you might, for example, want to give them the opportunity to stay there for a time if you were to die. So, that needs to be thought about and put into a new will, and vice versa, if you've moved into their property. And then finally, if you do decide to take the next step and remarry, then you need to be thinking, do I actually want a prenuptial agreement? Do I want to preserve the protections that I had in a cohabitation or with a declaration of trust? Do I want to preserve it and have it actually written into some form of prenuptial agreement? Again, it depends on everybody's circumstances are so different, and really these are the sorts of things that you want to be talking to a lawyer about. And likewise with the cohabitation agreement, I should probably also mention that these things, like when you have your will drawn up, these are living documents. And by that I mean you don't just do it once and stick it on a shelf and forget about it. They do need to be reviewed, probably at least every 5 years. And certainly if your circumstances should change, particularly if children are born, then you really need to be dusting these things off and re-examining and making sure that everything is still fit for purpose.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually, isn't it? You don't make it and then not look back at it when things change, or for example, when you perhaps are thinking of making an investment into the property that you share together. When there are times of transition, it's worth going back and reassessing all those documents. So it might feel perhaps that it's a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of filling in forms and talking to lawyers and so on and so forth at a time when perhaps you're actually really excited about what the future holds with this person and with this relationship. I think what we're really saying here is make sure that you go into any new relationship, any new cohabiting relationship with your eyes really wide open. Make sure that you go in having had the discussions that you need to have, and that you go into it knowing that you've looked at your own motivations so that you're doing it in the full knowledge of where you stand and what it might mean for you.
Mm.
Um, there's a question popped up. I'm just going to see if uh, oh, okay. So this is really interesting, actually. So the question that's popped up here from somebody watching is around if you suspect that your ex-partner is actually cohabiting, but they haven't said so, or they have not declared it on their forms for the divorce. Is it possible to prove that they're living with a new partner to the court? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So, yes, there are lots of ways in which we would look at that. Um, so, the first thing to say is it going to be relevant? Because really, that person living with with a new partner is only going to be relevant if it's going to make a difference to the actual financial outcome.
Mm.
So, one thing that I'm very keen to impress on my clients is we don't want to spend your money racking up legal costs in charging down rabbit holes after things that aren't going to make any difference to the final outcome. So that's the first question to ask yourself and probably your lawyer is this going to make any difference? Even if we find out that they're cohabiting, what difference is it going to make? And so assess that against the cost of trying to prove it. But if you do decide that yes, this is something that is going to be key, I need to find this out one way or the other, then your first port of call would be in their financial disclosure. Are they in their financial disclosure? Is there evidence of other people paying money to them to help them with their bills? Is there evidence of them paying money into otherwise undisclosed accounts? Maybe, like Claire said, they've set up a joint account with this person, they're paying money in regularly to fund the bills of the new property. Or is there no evidence of them meeting their outgoings? So you look at their bank statements and they're not paying any rent, they're not paying a mortgage, actually, they're not paying any utility bills. Um, where is this person's council tax being paid from? These are all bills that everybody pays. And if they're not evident from their disclosure, then it's likely to point to the fact that somebody else or some other way is being found for them to fund their lifestyle. So those are all good indicators. Have they been on a holiday recently? Is there evidence in their bank account of them paying for their own holiday? Or actually, has it been funded by somebody else? That sort of stuff. And then really at the extreme end, we can employ inquiry agents, you know, can't remember what you would call it. Yes, inquiry agents really to spend a period of time watching that person, seeing where they go. If they've given you address that they're supposed to be living at, are they there? Are they there at key times of day? You know, are they there at 5 o'clock in the morning? Are they there, you know, in the evenings? And if they're not there, then where are they? So yes, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and those things can really add up in costs, can't they? So that first question that you mentioned is hugely important. You know, is it actually going to make any difference to the outcome of my case? So I guess that's the first point to really look at. And the other thing from a sort of more emotional perspective, I think, is to really look at, and obviously I don't know, this person obviously, but to look at what are my motivations actually? You know, am I doing this because I want to punish my ex-partner in some way, or am I doing it because actually it will really make a difference to the outcome of my case? So have a really close look at deep down what is your main motivation for actually wanting to prove this to the court? Because if it's not going to make any difference to your case, then really it's maybe something to work around sort of letting go of with a coach or a therapist or something like that.
Yeah.
I hope
Because
that's answered the
yeah,
question.
because sometimes I do find this with clients is that um, you know, the other person is insisting that there's no new relationship
Mm,
happening. And of course, you know, our clients have natural suspicions. And I think sometimes, you know, that there may have been some gaslighting going on where the former partner's saying, no, you're going mad, you're imagining this
mm,
new relationship into existence. It doesn't exist. And so very naturally, by the time the clients come to us, you know, they're hell bent on, you know, knowing for certain whether or not that thing is true. So it comes from a really understandable place. But
yeah,
yeah, I think it's really good advice to consider carefully. Is it actually going to do you any good to find out?
yeah, yeah. And that's the first question, really, isn't it? Is it going to make any difference?
Mm.
So I hope that that's answered the question. And we are pretty much at the end of our time now. And before we finished, I just wanted to mention some of the other episodes that we have had in the past in relation to the issues that we've talked about today. So if you have a look back at all the resources, there are previous episodes on dating and new relationships. There's an episode around trust as well and building trust again after a divorce. I think there's another episode about creating the blueprint for a new future, and another one about red flags and things to look out for in new relationships, as well as the blended family episode that I mentioned before. So there's lots and lots and lots of information in the kind of the back catalogue of these webinars for you to go and have a look at and explore. And unless there are any other questions, I think we've come to the end. So Fiona, thank you ever so much. That's
Thank
a
you
huge
much.
amount of information that you've given our listeners today. So I hope that it's really, really valuable to them. And we'll see everybody next month. Thank
Thank
you.
you.